Okay. So, good morning, Ethelbert.
Good morning to you, Miho.
We have a 14-hour time difference this time. It
Okay.
is, 6 a.m. Japan time, and you're 4 p.m. Washington time.
hmm
So I asked you that I want to hear about your travels, the travels abroad. And I have a list of countries you have visited here. And then you gave me the list of places you visited as a writer, excluding your private trips. I noticed because Jamaica is not on the list, right?
Right, yeah, because that was more like my son's wedding.
hmm Right, yes. But I think the point I wanted to talk to you about is traveling as a writer. What does it do to a writer? And you had the plans or what you thought after the trips. Those are the kind of things I wanted to ask you. So that's kind of perfect. Let's look at if you think about the places you have visited, do you have some overall comment how you developed? Because the first trip is a long time ago, 1972. You were very young. Then you went to a very unusual place, Soviet Union. And then over the years, you of course grew as a writer, as a person, grew older, family grew. Yeah. So do you have any overall comment?
I think the overall comments, whenever I was abroad, I realized that the only reason why I was abroad was because I was a writer. I
hmm
would not have been any of these places if my writing hadn't been something that someone knew or was part of my identity. Even when I was at Howard, people knew me as a writer. Um, Even when we went over to Russia, USSR at that time. Um, Many people who were putting the trip together was hoping that we would come back and talk about our experiences in the USSR. So it wasn't just like go and visit, but the thing was going back and talking about what you saw. And I think that for some of the other countries I went to, especially like Cuba and Nicaragua, people wanted you to talk about what you saw. Primarily because at that time, we still were dealing with like a Cold War. We still were dealing with, communism. So countries, like a new country like Nicaragua was trying to sell you on the revolution that they had had against Somoza. So when I would, every now and then I would say, wow, look at where I am. And I'm there because I was a writer. I got invited to Iraq because I was a writer. I took some trips from the State Department to give lectures overseas. I don't think the department would have recognized me or recommended me for a trip if they didn't know me as a writer. So that's the
hmm
thing I feel connects all my trips abroad, that I travel as a writer. And because of that, I make sure that I dress appropriately. I dress as I always make sure that I'm in a suit and tie, um, primarily because I felt if no one if I was the first African American that somebody saw, I wanted to have a positive image that I
hmm
was who I was. I wanted to carry myself with a certain degree of dignity, and sort of saw myself as sort of like a statesman, or the type of writer that I would read about, like Neruda, people who were also diplomats. I wanted to carry myself that way. So those were my models when I went abroad.
When we say writers or when we say poets, and then when we say activists, which element of you the people wanted? I mean, did you go there as a poet or
Many
activist?
times of people, like if I went overseas to like say England, I was a guest at I was attending the Radical um, Black Book Festival that was there.
hmm
So if I went to Iraq, I was attending a festival there of
hmm
writers.
hmm
So when I went to Italy, I was as a writer, giving workshops to Americans in the military
hmm
forces.
hmm
So that was the thing where my writing um, determined the type of trip I was going to have.
hmm
And it made me very responsible in terms of seeing myself as a writer that was not just willing to sit at home and write, but a writer
hmm
who felt that he or she could share their work with others,
Mhm.
especially people who are not necessarily, you know, um, thinking about writing, so like somebody in the
Mhm.
military. And
Mhm.
so you realize that you can use your skill as a writer to bring people together, you know, talk about not just your own writing, but literature. I always felt that I
Mhm.
was an ambassador for African American literature.
Mhm.
I always had a no problem in terms of being seen and accepted as a black writer. I used to put
Mhm.
an emphasis on that,
Mhm.
primarily because I realized what it meant to be a black person on the world stage.
Mhm.
Um, I didn't want to be in a situation where I'm apologizing for being black or felt that
Mhm.
being black was something that was derogatory. I was celebrating, my culture. I was celebrating those writers that I read who had international reputations,
Mhm.
like someone like Langston
Mhm.
Hughes. So
Mhm.
I saw myself on the stage. And I guess also later on, I became very conscious of people like Paul Robeson and his life and how political he was. And
Mhm.
that was one of the things that when I was overseas,
Mhm.
um, I always make sure I did not criticize the U.S. like foreign policy when I was overseas. I would say things. There's things I would not say overseas that I would say if I was within the U.S. I would be more
Mhm.
critical if I was, speaking here in Washington at some think tank or some sort of forum, as
Mhm.
opposed
Mhm.
to, being in somewhere
Mhm.
like Tel Aviv and somebody asked me about,
Mhm.
Zionism or something like that. I never wanted to have a situation where I said
Mhm.
something overseas, it got picked up in the media, and then I came back and I had to apologize for it. I always have
Mhm.
more responsibility in terms of whatever I said abroad as
Right.
a writer. And being a writer, I knew that someone could take
Right.
something out of context and put it in, like say that this is what he was trying to say.
Yeah. But that's kind of a there's an very interesting intersection from what you're saying because people abroad, including myself, I think, we see you as an American first. And maybe you might have a you might I want you to talk about a little bit about your festival in Britain. In the that was you met a lot of writers, Black writers from all around the world, I believe. So,
I think key writers. When I think about that experience, Linton Kwesi Johnson, Grace Nichols, also because it was International Black Radical Book Festival. I was also meeting, and Black was being broadened in terms of when
mm,
we say Black in, say, England, we're talking about somebody who might be from India or Pakistan.
mhm,
So when I looked at some of the writers I was meeting back then, I was
mhm,
meeting a number of them from different countries.
mhm,
Many of them were very, very political. There are, many writers who, if they're coming from other parts of the black world, for instance, a key issue that they're dealing with is colonialism. I might be dealing with American slavery, but you're dealing with colonization. You're dealing with that whole body of writers, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, writers who, or even like Aimé Césaire and the writers for the Negritude movement. Once you start dealing with people from like the Francophone countries and things like that, so you're dealing with colonialism.
mhm,
You become very much aware of how language divides black people.
mhm,
If I'm from Brazil, I'm speaking Portuguese. Or I'm from France, I'm speaking
mhm,
French.
mhm,
And so, going to a radical book festival and meeting other writers. Um, this was before people like Paul Gilroy was talking about the Black Atlantic and stuff like that.
mhm,
You
mhm,
know, um, I think also for me, the connection that I had with some of the writers, and I would say this: the writers who invited me were part of the Race Today magazine. I think it's what's Dark is his name. I forget his last name, but people who were very close to CeeLar James, from Trinidad, is also going overseas and interacting with that community. It made me very much aware of the fact that I was West Indian, that my family had roots in
mhm,
Barbados and Panama. And that was very important. I would come to recognize that and appreciate that later on in my career as a writer. But at that time, my friendship with CeeLar James opened a lot of doors um, to writers over there, and
Mm-hmm.
I was deeply grateful that that was part of my education
Mm-hmm.
outside the classroom.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about, so for example, I am Japanese,
Hmm.
and when I'm in the States, I'm often invited to talk about, Hiroshima or Nagasaki, the Japanese as victims. But definitely Japan has both sides. Of course, attacking Pearl Harbor was one, but also invaded huge areas in Asia. So, as a Japanese person, I guess I'm a person of color, but then again, we have this side of invaders and then oppressors. So it's always kind of in between. And as an American, American uh, as a country, we recognize as a huge military power, so much influence commercially, influencing a lot of people, entire 20th century. How do you kind of balance?
Well, I think it has to look at some of the countries that I went to.
Mhm,
Um, if I'm in Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the Middle East, I'm dealing with, as an American, I have a different perspective than if, say, for example, I grew up in England.
mhm,
I'm just looking at, once again, the whole thing of colonialism.
mhm,
If I'm in certain parts of Africa, I'm dealing with, am I dealing with Portugal? Am I dealing with France? So that shapes you. This is where people say, well, America really, outside like maybe like Liberia, really don't have a presence within
mhm,
Africa. The way the
mhm,
European countries
mhm,
have Belgium or France or Portugal. We don't
mhm,
have that relationship. So, sometimes when I was traveling overseas, like for example, when I was in the Middle East, like Yemen, for example, someone thought I was from Egypt. You know, um, I remember when I was in Cuba, this woman passed by and asked like where I was from. And I said, "Oh, you speak English?" And she said, and she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from America." And then she just say, "Oh, an American darky," you know. It was very interesting where at that time, keep in mind when I'm visiting, Cuba had expanded its foreign policy and was helping to we were in solidarity with the various liberation movements in Africa, like what was going on in Angola and Mozambique. So
mhm,
it wouldn't be unusual to see some black skinned person who was, studying medicine or something in Cuba, or the fact that when you talk about Cuba, Cuba has a very strong, Afro-Cuban presence and it's within its society. But in this case, because I looked different, and the woman immediately knew I didn't know how to speak Spanish. She knew I was from somewhere else, and when she thought I was from, American a Yankee, American darky, I put that actual conversation of one of my poems, Spanish Conversation. Because she thought, oh, I can't, you don't seem to be the such and such. And I said, yeah, sometimes I don't feel to be that such and such either. So, yeah, that would be like a found.
what do you think? Sorry,
Hmm?
what do you think she meant by American darky? What was the
Oh,
general
very easy, very
conception of
easy.
people?
Oh, what happened is that, first of all, I didn't speak Spanish. I mean, that was a key thing, and I
Hmm.
didn't look. I carried myself. That was a key thing, and because I asked her where she said something in English, and I was like, oh wow, this woman, where
Yeah.
you,
But
so
how does she feel about American people?
well, what happens is that if you look at, Cuba's only 90 miles from the U.S., and so it's
Hmm.
not like we're completely different. People do see, but because of the blockade and things of that sort, Cuba has been somewhat
Hmm.
isolated, from
Hmm.
the mainstream. In terms of
Hmm.
if I outside Havana, there's a good
Hmm.
chance, I may not see. I might see a Russian before I see a African American, an African American. If I'm in Havana, I have a long line, musicians and stuff, people, baseball player, I would see more. But what happens is that because of the blockade, and this is very sad, Cuba has been
Hmm.
isolated,
Hmm.
from the United States. And then when you go back, and looking at U.S. history, there were U.S. history. I'm thinking about what's happening today with Trump talking about like Panama should be ours and renaming the Gulf of Mexico, which is sort of and quoting McKinley. I was like saying this guy should be quoting James K. Polk, this whole manifest destiny, which was a term he actually used. And keep in mind when we look at Cuba and also Haiti, people were talking about expanding the South and spreading slavery into, back into Cuba and Haiti and places like that. And so does as part of the Americas. And that's part of almost like the Monroe Doctrine, like this hemisphere is ours, and this is why, when any, Russia was trying to get into Cuba, or how even today, um, Trump is talking about like the Chinese are taking over the Panama Canal. So it's almost like saying they're invading our hemisphere. And that's why, okay, we're going to rename it for Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. And when you look at that, we're talking about my trips to these various countries. When you look at what's happening now, and this is 2025, all of a sudden he says, yes, and we're going to go to Mars. And Musk jumps up in the back cheering it on. And, I mean, when I was coming of age, it was like Kennedy talking about the next frontier, which was space, you know. But I think that when you're traveling around the world, for my travels, I got a better sense of what was happening on this planet. And that changed me as a writer. Going back to the first trip I took, going up to USSR, because I had not been, like some of my friends, I had not been to, like, say, London or Paris. I had not been to Europe. Okay. I had no sense of what Europe was other than something in a textbook or a French Revolution or something like that. That when I really went to Russia, went from New York to like Moscow, I was hit with like, wow, this country is a very poor country. A very poor country. And that all of a sudden, how I had seen the world divide up, I'm coming through the Cold War. Russia is this big country, powerful country. It's powerful in terms of military might, but in terms of actual standard of living of the average Russian, that's far below the U.S. And that was a wake
Mhm.
up call, and
Mhm.
that's where, if you're a writer traveling around the world, one of the things that you will encounter are issues like race. You will encounter issues of like gender inequality, especially if you're in Muslim countries. But then one of the things that you will see wherever you go is the level of poverty
Mhm.
worldwide, poverty worldwide,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
many people just don't have things. And that's very sad.
Mhm.
And it's basic things in terms of even like water, clean water.
Right. Yes. I think seeing abroad it's a wake up call, definitely. Wherever you go, there are certain
Hmm.
conceptions, preconceptions that you have, and oh, it is really not like that. And also being there as a foreigner, and then the way I am looking at people and people looking at me are two different things. So very interesting things happens overseas. Um, let's talk about your trip to Tanzania,
Hmm.
because you went there to document an
Yeah, I went
event.
there. Yeah, I went there. I was part of the U.S. delegation to attend the Sixth Pan African Congress. The last, fifth one was in, I think, Manchester, England, 1945. You know,
So what do you mean by Pan-African?
well, what happens is that when you get into, it's funny, I can link it to what was just happening
Mm-hmm.
today, where President Biden, well, former President Biden now, pardoned Marcus Garvey. And if you go back to
Mm-hmm.
the 1920s, I mentioned Langston Hughes, I could talk
Mm-hmm.
about Du Bois or Countee Cullen, Claude McKay. Anybody coming through the 1920s, or what they call the New Negro Movement. The backdrop of the whole New Negro Movement is the Marcus Garvey movement, UNIA movement, Universal Negro Improvement Association. He created this climate of sense in terms of wherever you are as a black person in the world, Africa is still the center. Okay. And so you get this pan, like we're all African
Mm-hmm.
people. And that is the type of situation where it goes against the thinking where how people view Africa, because if you're a Pan-Africanist, you're not you're opposing the images of Africa that come through like Tarzan movies and the stereotypes of being the dark continent. You're celebrating
Mm-hmm.
Africa culture before the European quote invasion. You're celebrating many times. You're looking at Africa as an entire continent, and so all of a sudden you would tell people, "Oh, Egypt is part of Africa." Okay, it's so what happens is that some people like try to talk about North Africa, South Africa, um, but if you're a Pan Africanist, you're not dividing that. up into north, south. You're looking at the entire continent, and then you're
Mhm.
looking at the black presence in the Americas. So if you're Pan Africanist, and take Marcus Garvey, he's coming out of Jamaica. Then what happens is that, yeah, you see all the islands connected, you see the black presence in Brazil, and all of that has a lot to do where all of a sudden now you realize you are not a minority. You're
Mhm.
saying you are, when people say you have no history, you can say, okay, yo, we're the cradle of civilization. It changes the whole type of thinking. And now Garvey had his, money in terms of uh, ships, his Black Line ship going back to Africa, and they have this thing like everybody going back to Africa. But and when you go back to the Civil War and you realize that there was this whole thing after the Civil War, there were Southerners and even Northerners like, okay, let's take the Africans who are or the blacks who are newly emancipated slaves, send them out of the country. Even Lincoln was for that. Like let's just free them and ship them somewhere else. Okay, and so you look up and we do have that in terms of Liberia. It's basically one of the countries where people who are African American slaves go back, or free men go back and are key to Liberia's history, which is problematic at times. But what happens in terms of when I'm coming up in the 70s and going to the Sixth Pan African Congress, at that time, one of the people that would promote Pan Africanism would be Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. He becomes extremely important. When I went off to college, one key book that I had was Black Power by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. And so I was into that. But what happened between like Stokely Carmichael emerging, from being active in the, in down south and SNCC and things, and that's organization like that, his transformation was very key, because he's the one that talks about Black Power, Black Power, Black Power, and that becomes really a term that becomes very popular, like around 1966 into 67, Black Power, and that was a thing where, you know, Stokely Carmichael left the country, wound up marrying Mary McKeever, the singer, but then what happened? He became a student of Sekou Touré, who was the leader of Guinea. Two of the key African leaders, well, several key African leaders which is very important because I'm reading these leaders before I go to Africa. So I'm reading Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. I'm reading Sekou Touré in Guinea. I'm reading Julius Nyerere from Tanzania. I'm reading Kenneth Kwana from Zambia, I believe. I know about Idi Amin in Uganda. So these are all African. I know about NASA, in terms of Egypt. So I know all of these names, okay? But Stokely Carmichael studied under Sekou Touré. So he left the United States, spent that time in Africa. When he came back around 1970, I believe it was 1970, he gives a speech on the campus of Howard University. Okay, I believe I think I videotaped that speech actually. And he came back. He was, he's a handsome guy. He had a little suit, man. He was like, he was clean, man. He was like a rock star, man. He came out in there, man. We were all like students on the college campus, and I remember that. And then he makes a statement that Pan-Africanism is the highest level of Black power. So he takes it. Yes, we went into Black power, but now what happens? We got to reach another level, and the level of awareness is Pan-Africanism. And so it's not like Garvey's hoping to, get people to go back to Africa. The thing is that you were spiritually realized that you had a connection, okay? And that spiritual connection is very uplifting, okay? Keep in mind that when Kwame Ture is talking going from Black Power to Pan-Africanism, within that, this is where I come in. You've got the Black Arts Movement. You've got people writing, Nikki Giovanni, Baraka, Donnelly, writing about Black is beautiful or, talking about revolution. But all this is happening. And when you look at the need around the world, if I go back to, say, 68, you were thinking about this. If you go back to 68, all around the world. I don't care if it was France. I don't care. It was like this revolution. People were protesting the Vietnam War. Wherever people were, there's this movement, and if you look at coming through the 60s, it begins in the 50s, but you have this whole thing of battling colonialism. So by the time of I'm getting ready to go to the Sixth Pan-African Congress, the key movements is UNITA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique. Those are the
Mhm.
countries that are really battling, and then keep in mind South Africa looking out for its own interests. This is when Rhodesia is Rhodesia, not Zimbabwe. So all these sort of movements happen now. This is what I was a witness to. You're organizing the Sixth Pan African Congress, and you got all these black
Mhm.
people coming, and it's going to be in
Mhm.
Tanzania, and you're President Julius Nyerere, and you've got a relationship with some of these countries that within these countries there's liberation movements to try to
Mhm.
topple the leader, right? So now you
Mhm.
have to say, okay, if I got this Pan African Congress organized in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, can I invite the head of a country as well as the liberation movement that's taking place? It became very, very, and in the middle of it, you've got African Americans, right?
Mhm.
So our delegation, and I was part of it because I'm videotaping, but I'm also part of this U.S. delegation that Sylvia Hill was who actually pulled it together. Let's mention that because if you see women really being key to the organizing of these conferences, but never given the credit. But what
Mhm.
happened is it was at a time when, and this is 74, within the black community here in the U.S., and Barack is a key example of it, black nationalism was being debated because there were a number of people in the movement coming out of the late 60s and dealing with black power and trying to get maybe somebody elected mayor of Newark or whatever, that they began to see that being black was not just the answer to everything, that there was an issue of class within the
Mhm.
black community. Okay. So you begin to see, and Barack is the best example of this, Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka, because he will move from being a key architect of black nationalism to become a Marxist Leninist. Okay. And that split back in 1974, that was the big split within the American delegation. You know, we're not just saying solidarity because we're Pan-Africanists. We're also saying, okay, we are also concerned about class struggle. So within the American delegation, you got people saying, we support this liberation movement. We're going against some of these other leaders. We're supporting these for Limo. We're supporting this, and that split. Okay, that split the delegation to the point that who spoke for the American delegation? We had the largest delegation, and we couldn't
Mhm.
agree on who to speak
Mhm.
to. Because there's panels and stuff going on.
Right.
Who speaks for the African American? See,
Mhm.
now going back to the point, you can say, okay, well, it's Marcus Garvey, even though the boys would say it's not just Garvey. Who's listening to Garvey? He's not, he's from Jamaica, But what happened is that this would happen, and I'm witness to this. And this is also affecting me because I'm seeing the absence of the black political leader. I'm looking at what's happening in terms of who are major thinkers. See, it's not like I'm living like I'm talking to W.B. Du Bois and I can say, oh, I'm talking to Paul Roman. I knew we were in trouble as a delegation and also as a group of people when the
Mhm.
only person that we could agree on to speak on behalf
Mhm.
of all African Americans was Lerone Bennett, who was from Ebony magazine. Okay,
Mhm.
who would work with me for a minute. Okay, Ebony magazine is a key black publication, with
Right.
pictures and stuff.
Right.
But
Right.
there was a time when my mother left and say, "Oh, we're not even gonna let that in the house." you know, you know
Yeah.
But Ebony magazine, if we look at what was happening within this delegation, if we start looking at class within the black community, then
Mhm.
Ebony magazine represents what? It represents the black middle class. So what
Mhm.
happened is and what do we mean by the black middle class? Ebony magazine, if we were graduate students and going back and looking at who's on the cover of these magazines and stuff like that, it always
Mhm.
would be some black person who had received success in the white world, whether they're a movie
Mhm.
star, singer, politician. It had to be
Mhm.
somebody
Okay.
that was black, but would receive a lot of success. Maybe they were the first this or the first that. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I'm going to put Jackie Robinson on the cover
Mm-hmm.
of Ebony magazine before
Mm-hmm.
I put Josh Gibson or Satchel Paige, because Jackie Robinson is the first integrated American League, and we're all
Mm-hmm.
trying to get in to the magazine. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like they have an article on Richard Wright. They got
Oh.
Richard Wright, and then, successful black writer Richard Wright. I think, look, I think
Mm-hmm.
he
Mm-hmm.
had pictures of him in France and what happened, and it
Mm-hmm.
got down to like where his furniture was from his house. Like he had made it. He had a white wife. He
Right.
got good furniture,
Mm-hmm.
and he's overseas in France. Now,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm reading Ebony magazine, and we can look at how Ebony magazine had an impact on Nelson Mandela, okay, in South Africa when he was in Robben
Mm-hmm.
Island.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a black person, young black person, and I pick up Ebony magazine, I'm flipping through it, and I see, wow, look at Richard Wright. Well, I want to go to Paris. And I'm in
Mm-hmm.
Clarksdale, Mississippi, right? Work with me. I'm in Clarksdale, Mississippi. There's no
Mm-hmm.
cafe and I have no
Mm-hmm.
wine and bread, okay? Or cheese,
No
okay?
baguette.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this is in my
Mm-hmm.
mind. You
Mm-hmm.
see, this is in my mind. And so what happened, I'm witnessing this in 74, that there is a definite problem as being African Americans on the world stage, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then also for me, this is where my readings become very much, I never call myself a Marxist or anything like that, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things I was reading were on the political left.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that would be reinforced because one of the key members of when you
Mm-hmm.
talk about intellectual thought, it's C.L.R. James. That's why I used to go around. I said, man, I'm talking to C.L.R. James, and C.L.R. James used to talk with Trotsky. What I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I could never balance that. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, if I was maybe in SNCC and I could say, "Oh yeah, I remember," talking to Martin Luther King in church, I could have something of that thing. But what began to move me, and I identified with Baraka more so than Haki Madhubuti or Don Lee, who, if you go back in my career and development, Don Lee has a lot to me becoming a poet because, he was first looking at my work. He wrote the introduction to one of my first collections of poetry. But politically, I began to side with Baraka, and I felt that what I had to learn from him was very, very important. But I say all of this, that if you look at 74, me being at that Sixth Pan African Congress, it changes me in a number of ways. I meet and shake hand with Jewish Nairi. Okay, Jewish Nairi was one of the more popular leaders for me, and that's why my son, name is Nair Gibran. I took his
Mm-hmm.
Jewish Nairi's last name and
Mm-hmm.
shortened it. But that was
Mm-hmm.
a very important part of for me. It was also um, being in Africa for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, being able to look up and see the sky for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
with the stars and constellations,
Right.
I mean, I
Right.
grew up,
Right.
the only constellation I could find on a dark night, it would be Orion with a little belt. Other than that, if somebody said, Ethelbert, do you know what the North Star is? I
Oh, so
say, no.
the belt buckle, you mean?
Yeah, right. No, yeah, yeah.
Oh, I knew it's
Yeah,
a
I can
okay.
recognize those stars. When somebody says, "Oh, do you see that planet Venus there?" No, I can't see
Uh,
Venus.
yeah.
I see the
Right.
moon. I see the
Mm-hmm.
moon.
Mm-hmm.
But what
Yeah.
happens is that when I was in Africa, in Dar es Salaam, because I'm outside of cities and things of that sort, it was spectacular. Okay. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing that I remember was my friend Hadari playing early in one morning, John Coltrane's Love Supreme. That music just sort of resonated. When you hear something, you like say, "Oh man, I could listen to somebody, play that in Carnegie Hall or some, Kennedy Center, something like that." But I heard it
Mm-hmm.
in South Africa, and all of a sudden, what you realize, maybe because of the stars and this and that, how spiritual this music is.
Right.
Love Supreme if is a very, very spiritual
Mm-hmm.
composition.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard that. And I say that because as I'm talking to you, that is still a incident that I recall. I attended this conference. I do remember one of the things that happened because I was videotaping and interviewing people. That's when I would begin. That's where I met Dennis Brutus, the poet
Mm-hmm.
from South Africa. And
Mm.
that would be a very important relationship. And I would publish that interview
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah, music as connector is very interesting. I am reading about like an interview between the Palestinian and Israeli person. They're both talking about music, how that connect. And
It was
also
Saeed you were reading.
yes, right. Yeah, the Said and Wallenbaum. Wallenbaum has like a 4 or 5 different nationalities and he speaks several languages and it's very
Mm,
difficult to define, but I think his definite thing is yeah, being Jewish is a major part of it. And also, it's really interesting that I do like Western classical music and there is no background in the bone of me, anything to do. But,
mhm.
music it really goes beyond that, nationality or race. There is something. So probably we could talk about
But
music
right?
alone,
But but
for hours.
when you say that, and this is the other thing, here's a country that I left off the list. That's Hungary.
Mm, right.
Because what happens is the other thing that we find out that is very universal along with music is how we view literature. One of the things that when you travel around the world and you're an American writer, you realize that people know more about American writers than like when I was in Hungary, I don't know the Hungarian writers. Okay.
Mm,
And that is true where if someone's traveling, within the Americas, people know Faulkner and,
Whitman,
Hemingway,
Mark Twain,
Mark Twain
yeah.
before they know, we may
Hmm.
know Neruda, we may know some
Hmm.
of those, but Octavia Paz, somebody like that, but Fuentes, but we're not that fluent.
Hmm.
And one of it is that it's not taught, like if, for
Hmm.
example, if I look at my
Hmm.
relationship with you, Miho, I didn't know Japanese, right? What's that, Mishima? This about the only person I could maybe name, um, because those books are not part of the curriculum,
Hmm.
okay? And I mean, I'm talking about undergraduate where I could take a humanities course or something or great books or
Hmm.
whatever,
Hmm.
and I would get no African writers.
Hmm.
Okay, I might get
Hmm.
maybe a West Indian writer would sneak in. Of course, the
Hmm.
writers that receive Nobel prizes and people like that, become a little more well known.
Hmm.
But even though if we look at some of the Japanese writers that won the Nobel Prize, they're not as well
Hmm.
known as say Toni Morrison.
Hmm.
You see,
Hmm. Right. Yeah, of course.
and that has a lot to do when you travel and you go to these receptions and someone wants to talk to you about literature, and all of a sudden you realize that their knowledge of world literature is much greater than say my own.
Mm. Hmm. Well, it does happen. Even like, for example, I talk a lot about haiku, but
Hmm.
I realized I really should know everything about haiku I can learn
Right.
because I'm regarded that way from outside. Oh, Miho is a poet. She must write haiku. So, it's that way. But I think what we're talking about here is very closely related to language.
Hmm.
So, when you're talking about Pan-African, I really don't know much about African literature. However, I read a lot about Dambuzo Marcella, the Rhodesian writer. And he was really in the middle of become Rhodesia to Zimbabwe right there. And
Hmm.
one big thing about is he went to England and he was writing in English. However, what he did was he used English in his own way. He had
Hmm.
to change it because the English definitely was the oppressor's language. So he needed to just to distract the whole thing and then put it back together in his own way. That was the only way he wanted to write. So
Hmm.
English is a prevalent language, all over the world. And you didn't know about Japanese writers because you always have to read it in translation, and not everything
Hmm.
is translated. And some of the writers that we're reading, like Yoko Gawa, her old one, just a couple of old ones, is translated. And Murakami, it's been translated for 30 years. He is a great exception. Everybody
Hmm.
else, and there are so many more writers, and even those the names, there are so many other works.
And
So it takes a little bit different steps to get to
well,
it.
talking about different stuff, I just realized something, and there's one name that I haven't mentioned, and I
Mm,
realized this is also an essay that I've written about the person. And the person, in his last
mm,
speech, he says he makes reference to my that the future would be me in terms of what I was doing, and that is Leon Demas. Now, Leon Demas, you familiar with
mm,
Leon Demas? Leon
mm,
Demas, okay, Leon Demas is extremely important, especially if we talk about the Sixth Pan African Congress and things of that sort, because and if we talk about the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement. We say New Negro movement because we realize that everybody was not in Harlem. A lot of people were in D.C., but it's a Harlem Renaissance because it's Harlem, but as opposed
right,
to
right, right.
Northwest
Hmm.
Washington. But what happens is that during that time, we talk about this Renaissance, this flourishing of African American literature.
Hmm.
And sometimes we say, okay, when did it end? And some people say that it ended, when the Depression came in and stuff like that. But what we begin to see, if we're literature, is that the Harlem Renaissance skips over, crosses the Atlantic, and goes to France and radicalizes a whole body of young black students who are in universities and stuff who come
Hmm.
together. And so the three key people who are the founders of the Negritude movement, say we got to honor that the Negritude movement is a major movement. The Negritude movement consists of three founders are Leopold Senghor, who would become president of Senegal,
Hmm.
Aimé Césaire, key in terms of Martinique, and
Hmm.
then Damas, Leon Damas
Hmm. Hmm.
from the Americas. God, my mind is just gone blank. But the most militant one was Damas. Okay,
Hmm.
Leon Damas was the most militant one. Now, my whole image of a writer is I'm at Howard
Hmm.
and I'm working with Stephen Henderson. The Henderson book is coming out soon, and
Hmm.
they have the first meeting
Hmm.
of the board of the Institute
Hmm.
for Arts and Humanities, and it's up in the
Hmm.
president's office up at on the fourth floor of the administration building
Hmm.
at Howard University. So we're all in these
Hmm.
big chairs and stuff, and
Hmm.
it's the first meeting. So we go around to
Hmm.
introduce ourselves. It's
Hmm.
like Dr. So and so, head of such and such, Dr. So and so,
Hmm.
head of such and such, right? It goes around, right?
Hmm.
And there, when it turned got to this man who always kept his always clean three-piece suit, goes suit, leg cross, and he just said, Damas. And I fell in love. As I tell people, I fell in love with him immediately. And we become really good friends. And I tell
That's why
you,
your business card just said Ethelbert.
you're absolutely right. What happened, and this is what happens, is my friend. I mean, this is for the record is Timothy Knight. I should say this is really funny. this, this is really Tim Knight. I gotta say this. Somebody will. I gotta be told. It's a funny joke on two levels. But Timothy Knight was next door to me in the dorm, right? And he be like playing. He was a drummer. He was like "Do-do-do-do, do-do-do." So he practiced like that, right? And Timothy Knight, he had a girlfriend, right? And this is when I was responsible. I put this on record. I'm responsible for the reason why Howard University has co-visitation. I mean, I pushed that was the thing I was pushing co-visitation, right? Many of the guys in the dorm,
Co-visitation.
yeah, where you could have. See, when I came to Howard, there was sort of like open door where you could have you could have a girl over to your door like once in the semester or something like that, and you had to have to keep the door open the width of a match matches, a patio matches. It had to be that when it had the door had to stay
No,
open.
it should be a fist.
So what happened? Tim Lyon, his girlfriend, and this is I'm with Mickey, my first wife, and I remember because she did it right. What would happen? Timothy Knight would have his girlfriend over, who would keep the entire floor up when she was having sex. She was loud, she was moaning, and she was like she's going through this whole, and it's we were a dorm of men that didn't even have girlfriends or sex. Right? So what happened? One night, come next door, right? Mickey pounds on the door. It's not that good. Like she's just pounding on the door. Like shut up. Anyway, reason why Tim Knight is important for me is that when Tim Knight came to Howard, he was really dressed like a model. He was always, I mean, he
Mm.
dressed like a model. And then after graduation, I didn't see him for a while, but then I was in Silver Spring, and Timothy Knight was in a clothes store, men's warehouse. Yeah, he fit. So what happened? I go in there, he would fit my clothes and stuff, right? And then one thing, because he knew what I was into, he said, "Oh, let me show you what I got." And I didn't wear it that much, but he said, "You got to get a white vest." Like
Mm.
how Sterling Brown, because he said like Sterling Brown used to have it. He said, "You're a writer now. You need to start dressing like a writer." And I think because of Tina, now I'm talking about, that's another reason why I was wearing tie and sweaters and vests and stuff. And the other writer that had a nice vest was Robert Bly. I like Bly. Robert Bly always had his vest. But Damas, see, Damas was key. And then if I think of two conversations that changed my life and my career, one is Damas called me up and said, I'm doing a reading at the library, Martin Luther King Library. I want you to read with me. I'm going to read the French and you read the English. He said, yeah, no, he said, I had done this with Sterling Brown. That, Miho, that reading is recorded. And several years ago, some guys came from South America. They were organizing some exhibit here in DC. And they contacted me because of Damas. Because if you do a search, the only place you're going to find Damas reading in French and English is is what I did with him, and
Mhm.
that's very key. And then it's in the Henderson book that's coming out. One of the most powerful speeches Henderson ever gave was at the funeral. He gave the eulogy for Leon Damas. Okay.
Mm.
And one of the things DeMoss and Stephen Henderson were like brothers. They were the same height and stuff.
Mhm.
And I remember what affected me deeply. He said, DeMoss walks around this campus and nobody knows who he is. And I always felt that. It was the same way, like for
Mm.
Henderson, myself. We walk around the campus. Never, the school never really paid you any attention and stuff. No one
Mm.
knew the importance of DeMoss. In fact, DeMoss, because of Father Nigratu, he was head of African Studies. And then what
Mm.
happened, the Nigerians in the African Studies department had like a little coup to kick him out because he was not African. Say
Mm.
African Studies, and this guy's from French Guiana, there's like, no, you're not. Even though people would tell you that Damas, being very militant, he was the one that radicalized the thinkers in Africa. So, when I met Segor for one time, and that was because of we had a thing at the Corcoran. Senghor came, and that was met with us, and then Sila and Damas, and then
Mm.
the other thing, just for the record, um, one person that I wish I had more of knowledge and appreciation of, who used to come up to my office, really nice guy, very much a diplomat, Mercer Cook. Mercer Cook was very close friends to Leon DeMoss, invited DeMoss to Howard um,
Mm.
to give lectures way before I was on Howard's campus. But what happened is, once again, the language separation. Mercer Cook was French. He was a francophone. He has a book. It's the Militant Black Writer, which was Henderson and Mercer Cook. They shared the thing. And then what I wish I had known is that Mercer Cook's father, Marion Cook, was very close to Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Mm.
This whole connection. The
Mm.
same way, I started reading with Mae Miller later on, and Mae is the daughter of Kelly Miller. And when Mae was growing up, Dunbar used to stay at their house, you know, and Mae Miller is the reason Zora Neale Hurston came to Howard University because there's
Mm,
this thing where she said to Zora, "Oh, you could stay at, so you could stay at my house," because Zora didn't have any money,
mm,
you know. But I
mm,
say that in terms of Damas, if and I need to go back and find this essay because it's an essay I wrote that I totally forgot, and I don't mention Damas as much as I would mention like C.L.R. James. But
mm,
Damas is really, really key. And that's a whole body of stuff where I begin to show up in these books. If somebody's doing something on Damas, I show up on that. If somebody's doing something on
mm,
C.L.R. James, I'm showing up in these books. And I think I
mm,
go back to circle back to the 74. Once I'm beginning to go into this Six Pan African Congress, I'm looking at things internationally.
mhm.
Okay. And I'm also not just looking at that. I'm building connections. As I mentioned,
Right.
I would meet Dennis Brutus,
Mm,
there. The other person, oh man. Oh, I'll remember. There's a number of people I met. I could go down and make a list. I met them I met them at the Six Pan African Congress. And it's just amazing how those relationships would
mhm,
change later on.
mhm. Right.
Um,
Yeah, I
so
think we came a nice circle. We're still in Tanzania. But another thing I was thinking when you started talking about Pan-African Congress, yes,
Congress.
um, you went there to videotape. So
Hmm.
I wanted you to talk a little bit about, taking photographs, taking videos, which is very closely connected to you always having TV shows and well, radio is not
Oh
a
yeah,
visual, but
yeah, yeah.
how you view things and what, just not reading and talking about books, but adding the
Oh,
visual. Yeah,
well,
what does that do?
you know what happens. It's like you could look at how we're living right now, and we're dealing with social media. We're dealing with X or Twitter or whatever. We're dealing with the internet. We're dealing with cell phones.
Mhm,
When was at Howard, and this is like probably 68 to 72. What is coming in, is videotaping. Okay,
mm,
with the big camera, you had a porta pack, and you had a camera, you had to get the light thing. And so what happened is, I'm in the African Studies department. We had that capability. Okay, and this is why we were contacted, um, to videotape the Six Pan African Congress because we had that capability. We weren't a TV set, but we were a university. And then so
mhm,
they say, okay, this is a very important historical black college that has this sending this. We sent one, two. There's four of us that went. Okay, and we were doc. But what happened is even before that, my neighbor next to my other side, I mentioned Tim Knight was on one side, the other side was down the hall with Steve Jones. And Steve Jones was older, a little older than me and some of the other students. He was like might have been like a graduate student,
mhm,
living in the dorm. And he worked for Margaret Burroughs in Chicago. And Margaret Burroughs was the founder of the DuSable Museum in Chicago. And what happened, um, she wanted to she asked Steve, who like wants to work with the museum when he was in Chicago, like volunteer or whatever. He said, "Well, since you're in D.C., go over to Sterling Brown's house and get like a pipe or something that I could keep in the museum as like an artifact or something for Sterling Brown." So what happens? I tagged along. I tagged along with Steve, and I with the video camera, right? And we get over there, and just set it up, and Sterling got into it, man, like just talking and stuff like that. Like, when you guys coming back? And so what happened, we started videotaping Sterling Brown, so like on a regular basis, maybe going there, videotaping him like for an hour or whatever, saving those tapes. Now what happens, Stephen Henson, who's my teacher in the African Studies Department, he becomes director of the new unit, the Institute for Arts and Humanities, which was formed in
mm,
1973. And when you look at how it was structured, he made sure that the Institute would have a documentation unit in it.
mm,
Okay.
mm,
So now when you look at the history of the Institute, it has that documentation unit because I was like one of Henderson's favorite students. And when he decided to take this job to be head of the institute, I had just graduated. And so what happened, he was able to give me, I worked half-time for the Institute and half-time for African American Studies Department. So that's why I had a, little nice little salary there, just coming out of college. And then he wanted me to videotape, you know, I was videotaping things when he had a grant. He had a grant. So when I look at how next month I'm doing this Owen Dotson talk, my introduction to Owen Dotson is that Henderson said, "Oh, you got to interview Owen Dotson." So, I didn't know who, but I videotaped Owen Dotson. The other person that I documented by audio tape was Frank Marshall Davis. I didn't know who Frank Marshall Davis was. Years later, we find out that Frank Marshall Davis was the mentor to Barack Obama when in Hawaii. But he was just a guy who was fed up with the U.S. and left the U.S. mainland and went to Hawaii to live. And nobody ever saw him until Henderson brought him out, invited him back to the U.S. Um, but we were documenting stuff because we had the capability, okay, and that opened the door for me to record stuff and preservation. And then when I took over as the full-time director of the Resource Center, my friend Amazu Bolton took my job. And so Amos was also working with the Institute for Arts and Humanities. But I had gotten into the whole thing of documenting to show you what would happen. Joanne Gabin, who I'm going to be interviewing in September, Joanne Gabin was the founder of Furious Flower. Her thesis, her book, is based on the Sterling. She wrote the first book on Sterling Brown, which is based because on those tapes. You say those tapes is what would enable her to have a thesis. So you can see where I've talked to you about sometime what we're doing is planting seeds. Yeah, we're planting seeds, and you don't know who's going to be using something years later. And so what happened, the documentation is key for preservation, but then it's also making sure that the material is going to be accessed and used by future scholars. It doesn't make
Yes.
sense to collect stuff if it's not going to be used to help people get a better understanding of a period or an individual. And I saw this where you could save a flyer or you could save a photograph. If you know how to read that flyer and read that photograph, you say, oh, okay, look at what building this person is standing in front of. What year was this? Okay. There might be a business that was whatever that happened to McDonald's, is in there. You're standing in front of an arch. It becomes very important. A flyer, you like say, okay, the address, okay, you get a sense of what was there before gentrification. Like this little cafe was not there anymore. Okay, so that becomes very, very important, especially when you're dealing with a scholar where he or she is really dealing with precision and documentation and wants to know exactly like Miho, where did Miho go when she went to Japan? She went stop. She's at her brother's house. You want to have that. What was the address? Where you can do that, and you never know because you're so exact as a scholar that you say, okay, Paul Laurence Dunbar lived at such and such street. Now, me as a photographer, years later, I want to shoot that building if it's still there. You see, and that becomes maybe some sort of humanities council says, okay, we can put that picture for our tour guide. So all of a sudden, it's just started because we gotta had an address. Okay, and this is where, oh, my friend Grace did this. When I got and this shows you an example. When I got my sister died, and I got my father's love letters to my mother, like 3 love letters. It had the address. It had the return address, so I knew exactly where my father lived in Harlem. I knew he was in Harlem, but I had the actual address. And what was really nice, my friend Grace, who lived in Harlem at that time, she went by and took a really nice picture of the brownstone. So I have that in the file. But that shows you in terms of preservation, documentation, but then directing scholars to the material. And then to show you what I'm concerned about, there are things that I saved. And then when I left Howard, even before I left Howard, I made sure that it would stay at Howard. So what I looked at is a lot of my stuff on Sterling Brown is at Howard. So if you were coming from Kentucky or Tennessee to do something on Sterling Brown, you don't have to be running around to George Washington University, American University, whatever. It's all there at Howard. Okay.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to make sure that a scholar could see things that were intact. Um, but I think now I really try to make sure that I talk about um, people, just like in this conversation. I totally forgot. I don't really make reference to Leon DeMond as the way I should, because that's very important. And then he makes reference
Mhm.
to me in his last public speech, because he was so fascinated by my
Mhm.
Ascension reading series and what I was doing. And he felt that this was what we should be doing because when you look at documentation and preservation, he was doing that in terms of the
Mhm.
importance of realizing as a continent as a whole what they should be saving, what we should focusing on, how we should be teaching, African literature and things of that sort. He's very key to that.
Mhm.
And this is why I have a lot of admiration for people like Henry Louis Gates, who's doing a lot of stuff from PBS, you know, um, just that sort of preservation and
Mhm.
creating archives and discovering writers that would become obscure if there wasn't somebody finding their papers or something. Very
Mhm.
important.
Yeah. I think we should close soon. It's about an
Okay.
hour. I
All
keep
right.
asking you to talk about it because you are at the crossroad and you are looking at writers and of course the politics and what's going on as a writer. So, you have a very different view of simply, I'd say, a journalist looking at it. You're looking
Hmm.
at the poet's eyes too. So I just like to keep our conversation going
This
and
is very important
record
for me.
whatever, yeah, that's something you can recall, and people wondering what's behind your, what's on the wall, and and provide some cues. So, well, let's do it again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Miho.
Thank you for
Okay.
your
So
time.
we're gonna stop the recording and then
Yes, I'll do that. Where do I
okay.
go?
You hit the
Stop
thing on the
recording.
bottom.
Yes.